Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle DiMarzo. I'm the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum in Fairfield, Connecticut. If this is your first time tuning in to one of our Art in Focus events, this is the virtual edition of what we do once a month down in the galleries, which is we take some stools and we sit in person in a small group around a single work of art, and we just have a conversation about it for 25 minutes or so. Usually in these virtual versions, we have a chat box through which you can offer your own ideas and responses and questions. We are having a technical issue with that today, so it is not active. So there's nothing wrong with your screen if you're seeing this. If you do have any feedback, any questions, please feel free to send them to museum@fairfield.edu, and we'd be happy to respond to any additional queries you might have. And hopefully we will have our chat box back and live for future virtual Art in Focus. So in that sense, today is going to be a little bit more of me talking to you than it might be a conversation between us, since unfortunately I cannot hear your questions. Luckily, I was just joined by a very active group of visitors down in the galleries for the 12 o'clock in-person Art in Focus. So I have plenty of their questions and observations to share with you about the subject of today's Art in Focus. This is part of the currently ongoing exhibition at the Fairfield University Art Museum, Monuments, Commemoration and Controversy. The show is organized by the New York Historical, and it's going to be on view in our Bellarmine Hall galleries through December 20th. So if you are in this area, you are welcome to come by and see the show. We are open Tuesday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. and until 8 p.m. every Thursday, and we are free and open to the public. So the show itself is really extraordinary. I've been describing it as a reflection on the stories that we tell ourselves about this country through the medium of monuments, what we put up on pedestals, what we tear down from pedestals, ideas for things that may never have wound up on a pedestal at all. And the show really begins with the object that is the focus of our Art in Focus today. So you could get a sense in that image of its relative scale and placement in the gallery. It's right underneath the title of the exhibition. We were just sitting directly in front of it a few moments ago. And one thing I will say, I'm actually going to go back to that view for a second. Even in this is showing actually with even more light than it felt like down in the gallery. Several of our visitors commented that the longer that we sat in front of the painting, the more they felt the luministic depiction of what is going on inside it sort of revealed itself to them. So two different individuals commented like, I'm seeing more. I thought it was just my glasses. Like the light is revealing itself more to me the more that I sit. And I will say that this is absolutely one of those oil paintings that really does repay close investigation. So if you are, again, local to this area and you can come see this in person, standing as close to it as you can. It has glass on it in the installation downstairs. So you always get that little bit of glare where you're trying to move around and see things with greater detail. But this artist absolutely has put an extraordinary amount of care into the scene. And one of the things with not only the group who is just with me in the gallery, but all of the many university classes who have come through, we always just start out by thinking about where our eye is drawn first, and then where it is drawn from there, and what sort of tricks the artist might have used to attract our attention to different areas of the painting. And we agreed in the group downstairs that our attention was not drawn necessarily to the statue on the plinth, but rather to the shirt of the gentleman directly beneath it. And going back to the full image here, so striking to me now, having just come from the gallery, how much more vibrant that white shirt seems when you're actually looking at the real object, as opposed to this even very high resolution image. As soon as someone pointed it out, it struck me, of course, I've been looking at the statue that is on the center axis, that is the title of this object, pulling down the statue of King George III, New York City. But they pointed out that it's that contrast of the white shirt against the darkness of the plinth draws your eye sort of dead center. And then they said their eyes moved over to the right because of, again, light, the way the light was falling on the faces of the individuals in the group to the right. And then the ropes carried them up to the statue. So even in that just sort of gentle initial exploration, the artist moving you through these visual cues to get you to start looking around what really is a very crowded scene. There are a lot of people in attendance at this event as this statue is being lashed with ropes and preparing to be pulled off its plinth. And we know that they're almost ready to do it because those ropes are taut, they are ready. The figure with the white shirt, who sort of his head is turned so we can't see his face, They really look like they need to get out of the way of the squash zone. That thing's going to come down directly on them in the next few moments. And around them is just such a vast crowd of individuals, both near and far. I'll take you through a few details. In this detail, you can see a closer view of the gentleman in the white shirt looking up, as well as two other figures, including one prone on the ground, holding his hat to his head. We see the gentleman to the lower left of the statue who's holding what looks like a rolled up piece of paper and gesturing very calmly. Something we noted downstairs is that although in one sense, this is a scene of political violence, this is a scene of revolution. This is depicting a moment, a historical moment in 1776, when shortly after hearing a reading of the brand new Declaration of Independence, colonists marched to Bowling Green on the southern tip of Manhattan, threw ropes around a larger than life-size gilded statue of King George III of England, pulled it down from its plinth, tore it to pieces, and eventually hauled it off to be turned into scrap and bullets for the Continental Army. I mean, this is our No Kings moment, right? This is where it begins, not just with the text, with the words of the Declaration, but then immediately following that with this demonstration of how do we show that we are in this? We are going to take down this very monumental depiction of the king's authority. We're going to rip it down as a group. And yet, there's not a strong sense of anger or violence or agitation. There's certainly a lot going on and people are reacting differently. But it's interesting to think about how the artist chose to portray many of the individuals who are involved, including this gentleman at lower left who's holding what we might imagine creatively to be a copy of that new Declaration of Independence. And certainly he's dressed like you imagine a Ben Franklin of 1776 would be dressed, his finest knee breeches and his hat and his very white ruff. And he's just calmly gesturing to what is about to happen. Off in the distance, because we are at the southern tip of Manhattan, you can see the masts of ships in the harbor. And you might be able to just make out in the corner of the house at the right a couple of silhouettes, because there are many more people watching this than the ones who are directly painted. Oh, I knew I'd thrown in another detail on the left there of this sort of group of very well-dressed looking men who are again calmly pointing to what is going on. In the distance behind them, on what looks like another plinth, we have a group of men who have climbed up just to watch the action. So one of them is raising a hand in the air. You see sort of feet dangling off of the sides. On the lower right-hand side, now you can see in the windows of the house in the distance, perhaps those silhouetted faces that are observing further back. And then you have just a snapshot of society. New York, 1776, we have men, women, and children. There is a dog too, but it's in the center of the painting, so it's not included in this detail. We've got three little kids in the foreground, these women, one of whom is very dramatically waving her scarf. And something that was pointed out by one of our participants in our group downstairs, they were looking at these three men on the right, and one of which has his hand up in this very elegant gesture, one is holding a torch, and one sort of has a hand raised like this. And one of the participants said that he felt the man holding the torch did not look like he agreed with what is happening. You can see that he has a torch in one hand and he sort of has his finger gesturing back toward the sculpture. Certainly he is engaged in some sort of dialogue with these two other men. And two things stuck out to me because this is one of those cases where I pop up and go closer to the painting. I was highlighting who this gentleman was talking about. And as I got close to it, I really noticed, and it is, I apologize, not as apparent in this detail as it is when you are looking at it closely. When we talk about the power of this artist's conjuring of light effects, the gentleman all the way to the right who has his hand up like this, close up, you can really appreciate the effort the artist has gone to make his palm look like it is being illumined from the front by the light of that torch. It's really extraordinary. It's very subtle. Is it part of the overall thrust of this picture? No, but it says something about the artist's overall goal. He really wants us to buy into the reality of this moment that he is depicting, even though he is doing it from the distance of 75 years. He wants us to believe that this is really how it happened. There were kids and there was noise and there was light and people were talking. And so even really tiny details like the light on the fingertips, I think is part of his way of building that illusion for us to buy into. And as I was making this observation and pointing it out close up, I realized sort of for the first time that the gentleman who's holding the torch is very clearly of a different social class than the two men that he's talking to. Because you'll notice that they, like the gentleman in the detail on the left, They have the tri-corner hats, or I guess they're more bicorn hats now that I'm looking at them. And they have the white, ruff. We see waistcoats, we see coats. These two men are dressed at a higher social level than the man who looks like he has a straw hat, not a black bicorn hat. He has an open cloth shirt. He has a sleeve rolled up. I can see his forearm. I mean, that is clearly someone who's working class. He could be a farmer, for example. So it is an interesting note that this is not, this is very much a mixed crowd in every way, in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of race, as we'll see in a moment, and in terms of social class. And from that, you could really interpret, as you would, what are the reactions of these men to what is happening? Now, Bill, the gentleman who made the comment initially, he felt that it was the man with the torch who seemed to be unsure of what's going on. For my part, I seem to think the gentleman who has the white wig and sort of the orange vest, he looks like he's a little bit doubtful. Like he's holding up his finger like, do we want to do this? Do we want to take this step? But all of that is us sort of putting our own projection. We're trying to read the intention on these faces. Certainly the women look a little bit apprehensive. Are they apprehensive merely because it's a chaotic night scene? Are they in some way concerned about the rebellion that is now going to follow, that this taking down the statue is a symbol of? You notice how these women have sort of tenderly clasped their hands, and the woman who's holding the smallest child, again, is flailing a white handkerchief. You could really spend a great deal of time examining the richness of human reaction to the moment that we're seeing. Two other details, taking us first to the lower left-hand corner of the painting and then to the bottom center. At the lower left, we see a Native American family, a man, a woman. The woman has a baby in her arms. There's a younger boy with a stick in front of his father. They are actually taking up quite a bit of real estate in the bottom left corner of the painting. And in the bottom center, directly adjacent to the young man in white, who has no shoes, who is maybe about to get crushed by the falling statue, we see that among his group is a black man who is on the ground in a red shirt and his hand sort of going up to his head, also looking upward as if worried that the statue is going to fall. And then at the very bottom, there's that dog. I said there was a dog, the kids, women, children, running over some ladders. That is a nice way of the artist giving us a little reminder of how they got those ropes up there in the first place. And although this is an anachronistic reference, I have joked that this artist seemed to be, he wants you to know that he's thought about all of the potential plot holes that you could find in his painting. You might have asked, for example, how did they get the ropes up there? And he's got ladders on the ground, and you might be able to make out just in front of the gentleman who's gesturing in this right-hand detail, there's a ladder going up the backside of the plinth. In the case of the Native American family, who are so wonderfully silhouetted by this colorful interaction of smoke and cloud and light behind him. If you look between their legs, you can see the campfire that's burning on the ground that is providing that illumination, in the same way that the torch is providing the illumination striking the hand of the man at the right-hand margin. So I just like to imagine this painter, the German-American painter Oertel, thinking like, no one is going to be able to find a flaw with what I've done. I'm going to make sure I've covered all of the angles. But in terms of talking about this as a painting that depicts a gathering of people that is diverse in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of race, we have him here giving fairly prominent portrayal, first to a Native American family, so not a lone Native American, and then to a Black man, which invites us to think about the moment that the painting depicts and also the moment in which it is painted. And one of the things, if you visit our exhibition website, which is fairfield.edu/museum/monuments, you can take a virtual tour and read all of the wall labels and accompanying text that comes with the show. New York Historical and the curator, Wendy Ikemoto, did such a wonderful job of sort of inviting us to probe these objects of visual art with questions about their constructed nature. And that actually seems like a very academic thing to say. What do I mean by constructed nature? Well, we're not looking at a photograph. And even if we were looking at a photograph, a technology not invented in 1776, it would still be in some ways artificial. We would ask, is this posed? What did the artist choose to, in the photographic frame, what did they crop out? What did they leave in? Did they edit the photograph during the printing process? In the same way, an oil painting, absolutely, we know, must be a construction of the artist's imagination. At the end of the day, this is a piece of canvas that has a bunch of colored paint smeared on it. It is only two-dimensional. And yet within it, the artist has given us this very rich tapestry that depicts this sort of chaotic but also inspiring event, this sort of founding moment of the United States, tearing down this symbol of monarchy. And he's placed in it, first underneath it, about to be crushed, a Black man, and given quite a lot of space at the lower left-hand corner to a Native American family. So one of the things that the New York Historical invited us to consider is, how does this fit into New York in 1776, when there would have been enslaved Black people, when Native Americans would not perhaps have been present on the island any longer, but were certainly still around in New England before increasingly would be pushed further west as the new United States took shape. And then there's 1851, when the painting's actually made, when certainly the United States government has been taking even more aggressive action toward Native American tribes and driving them onto reservations, when we are a decade and a half, or really a decade shy of the outbreak of the Civil War, of which slavery will be such an important, a key point. There might not have been enslaved Black Americans in New York in 1851, but there were elsewhere in the Union. And they don't provide any easy answers to this, in the sense that, and I should have gone back to the general picture here, there is no one answer to what this painting is supposed to be. On the one hand, in 1851, surely a triumphal look back at this moment, right after the reading of the Declaration of Independence, when these colonists, soon to be rebels, decide they will take down this very visible monument to the power of King George III, and then taking the additional step of turning it into musket balls to be fired at the King's army once the war broke out. But also, we look at this in 2025 and we ask different questions than we might have in 1851 or indeed in 1776. And so they point out that, is this intended to just be a diverse reimagining of the New York that might have been, with Native Americans, with Black individuals? Or do we look at this as, and I didn't actually include the painting they have next to it, they included it alongside a reproduction of a painting from 1938 that shows the same scene, but shows it only with white colonists tearing down the statue. And they just pose the question of, do we consider what is the more real representation of the past, or the more authentic, the one that would be more connected to what we believe the event actually looked like? Or do we look at one that sort of imaginatively expands it outward to include these other people? That said, they bring up, and certainly some of our university classes that have come through the museum have pointed out, there is this idea of, okay, this moment, the tearing down of the statue, the beginning of the Revolutionary War, declaring independence, it is going to be independence for a very small number of the people who are actually in this painting. In fact, we could look at the men who are lower left with this hand raised. We could look at the men over to the right-hand margin. That would not have included, in the fullest sense, the women, the children, the Black man, the Native American. So liberty and justice for all, initially coming with some asterisks after the title, and those groups later having to fight for their full participation in the stated ideals of the independence of this new nation. So it is not enough to just say, like, well, isn't it a nice image of what could have been? Everyone was invited and everyone was included in this. I mean, you can look at it that way, and certainly one of the powers and seduction of visual art is that it's kind of like a mind worm. Once you've seen this representation of the tearing down of the statue, it will stay with you. And you'll be like, yes, that big group that was there, and the women and the children, and everyone was together, because visual art is anything visual is very powerful and effective for us, which also is the reason I think the show exists. The visual, whether it is an actual statue or a painting depicting the removal of a monument, those are very powerful. We respond to them in an affective and emotional manner. One of our participants downstairs was very taken with the depiction of the Native American family. I'm going to go back here for a moment. And, was just remarking on the incredible level of detail. And he was asking, knowing this artist was a German immigrant to the United States, who arrived well after 1776, so could not have seen this event when it happened. He was just wondering about, was this connected to a European fascination with Native Americans? Which was a great question that I did not have an answer to, so I'm not going to pretend to answer one now. But I was able to share with him what I had learned from a faculty colleague here, Dr. Peter Bayers, who does have more experience working with Indigenous groups and looked at what this family is wearing and said, there is nothing specific to any actual Native group depicted here. So there's an incredible amount of detail in the accessories and the clothing and the accoutrements and this big jewel the father's wearing around his neck, but they are not real Native Americans. They are rather the artist's idea of a Native American. And what is more, if we consider their placement in the overall painting, and you look at the feet of the father, and even of the son who is looking back, sort of peering around his father at this moment happening, it rather looks like they are moving out of the frame. It looks like they are moving toward us. And clearly the artist spent a lot of time on them, framed them with light behind, and yet doesn't try to depict them as active participants in the moment, but rather you could interpret their position and direction as almost as if they are leaving, they are making way. They are not really part of what's going on here in the same way. And we talked for a few moments about, that is in many ways us in 2025 reading back into a painting made in 1851. I don't know necessarily that this painter, Oertel, what his idea is in 1851 is, again, probably to create a very positive and triumphal depiction of this very proud moment at the beginning of the American story. But of course, we're going to look at art with our eyes of the present and consider what other meanings it might hold. And I did just want to share, again, you can take the virtual tour of the exhibition on our website, but adjacent to the painting, so they have one painting that is another later depiction of the same event, and then they have this wonderful case that includes in it objects that for an art museum, this is a little unusual for us to have like historical artifacts included in our show, but that sort of oblong object, which many students have asked, perhaps, is it driftwood, is it log? That is a surviving piece of the tail of the original equestrian statue of George III. All of the gold has been stripped away. It is the lead that we are seeing there. And at the bottom right, those spheres are among the more than 42,000 lead balls that were formed from melting that statue down and turning them into musket balls in our own state of Connecticut. So it has an even more local tie-in for us, as that transformation of monarchical statue into war armaments happened in our own state. What is in the back of the case is a 3D printed replica of what it is believed the original statue of King George III actually looked like. And those of you who have either traveled to Rome in Italy or have a good art historical education might recognize the quotation that is happening in that model in the original statue of George III. And that is a reference to the statue of Marcus Aurelius, a larger than life-size gilded bronze statue that is still on view in the Capitoline Museums in Rome, Italy. And I mentioned that to contrast it with how our painter, Johannes Oertel, depicts the statue in his painting 75 years later. Now, we know from historical documentation that the statue looked like the Marcus Aurelius statue, as in the King George III wore a Roman crown of laurel leaves. He wore a Roman toga. That's not how Oertel is showing him. Oertel is showing him in a very much a British monarch's clothes. And even, I'll go back to our 3D replica, the original statue showed, like the Marcus Aurelius statue, the king astride a very calm horse with one foreleg raised in the air. Note that he doesn't even have stirrups with which to guide the horse because he does not need them. In contrast, we have George III atop a rearing stallion, not necessarily seeming in control. So when I've talked this painting through with folks in the gallery, I've actually often looked at that detail first because they can see the model that's in the case right adjacent, because it is a good way of reminding ourselves that, well, if Oertel is not faithful to depicting the statue as it was, that invites us to think about what other areas of the painting in which he might have taken some of that poetic license. But again, I can't emphasize enough how much there is to look at in this painting and how much fun it is to look at up close. So if you are in the Fairfield or Connecticut region, you have until December 20th to come to the Fairfield University Art Museum and see this painting in person before we must sadly return it to New York Historical, to whom we are very grateful for lending it during this period. And thank you so much for joining me for Art in Focus. I hope the next time we meet, we will have our chat box on. But as I mentioned, if you have questions or responses, please feel free to share them with us at museum@fairfield.edu. Have a great day, everyone.